Sandy, and thank you so much to all of the folks who are on the call, including those of us who were mildly traumatized by the recent events. I looked away for a second, looked back, anyways, so welcome and thank you. Next slide, Sandy. Sandy said that it might be useful for us to do a little bit of a primer on how we think about redistricting and the relationship to census. So we all know that this year we're busily trying to get people to respond to the census, and the Census Bureau has extended its timeline to try to collect that data from people, partly because being closed in our houses, the Census Bureau has not been able to send people out to do very active gathering of information from people's households when maybe they don't have a computer at home to respond online, or they aren't sure about responding. There are many, many community groups, obviously, that have lined up to try to be helpful as well, and many of them counted on an in-person type of outreach, and because that hasn't happened, the Census Bureau has announced that they're going to extend the time that they're gathering data through, we believe, October of this year. What that impacts on is then two things. One is that at the end of the year, December 31st, by law, the Census Bureau was supposed to release data state by state on how many people live in each state, so that we can decide how many representatives are allocated in Congress to each state, right? So I'll use California as my example since I'm a resident here. Our state, based on our population, has 53 members in the House of Representatives. And that is partly based on our population. Well, I guess it's entirely based on our population relative to other states. So sometimes you will hear about how decade to decade, if a state like California is growing, but we're not growing as fast, then we stay at 53. If we're not growing at all, or because people are moving to other states, we might lose a number of seats, as are expected in some states. And then some states that are growing faster than sort of all of their neighboring states will gain seats. So that's expected for a state like Texas, possibly states like Florida. So that all has an impact on then the number of seats that you're now drawing for the House of Representatives. You now have to redraw all of those lines because you want ultimately to make sure that each district has an equal number of residents. Okay, Sandy, so this is an imaginary country that has, I believe, some even number of people. I think it's 20 people or something like that. Will you hit next? Okay, and so next. This state, we imagine, has, yes, 20 people in it, and each of those districts then was drawn to have 5 people. Next. And so as people move or are born or immigrate to the U.S., then they are counted in the next round of redistricting. Next. And next. Keep hitting next a couple times, Sandy. So what you'll find is, and this is actually kind of a good example, if you happen to live in Southern California, you know that housing prices in close to the coast got very expensive, so lots of people moved inland to San Bernardino or Riverside, and so you had population that moved, you know, from the west coast to the east, and this happens everywhere, right, where when you are in a recession or times are hard, people move. And so we had significant population growth in places like San Bernardino and Riverside, and fewer people who live on the coast. And so now we find that the lines that have been drawn 10 years ago are still there, but the number of people have changed within those districts. And so some districts have 7 people or 8 people, and some have shrunk to 4. And the idea then is, the problem with that is that we want to draw districts that have an equal number of people so that each district has essentially the same voice when it comes to being able to elect their representatives, their elected representatives in Congress, but all the way down to your state legislature, your city council, your school board, all of those levels of government where there are districts. The idea is that you want to have districts that have an equal number of people, because the other side of it is, and this is brought very close to home when we think about the impact of the COVID crisis, when you have a representative who is representing an equal number of people, and when I say people, I use that term very specifically. I don't mean the number of voters. I mean the number of people, whether you are a naturalized citizen, you are a citizen who is born here, you are somebody who is in the process of immigrating to the U.S., but you are a resident in the U.S., you are over 18 years old, you are under 18 years old, you would be counted in that census count, and everybody would be taken care of, because ultimately that representative represents everybody who lives there, not just people who are voters. Okay, next. So the process of redistricting then is next. You're going to have to redraw those lines because lots of people moved to one part of the state rather than another, and you want to make sure that those lines are now containing an equal number of people. Next. Next. Yeah, just keep hitting next. Yeah, so now you have an equal number of people, and now it's 6 in each, right? So that process will start to take place next. As soon as we get these census numbers, which we are understanding from the Census Bureau that those numbers should be released sometime before and up to July 31st, 2021. That is approximately 4 months later than is usually. So what that means, it does affect a lot of different states and what might happen and whether lines can be redrawn in time for the upcoming elections. I'm going to save kind of what the impact is for any questions that people might have. Let me just quickly describe here next. So this is a sort of, again, an imaginary population of a community of 16 people that has 4 districts, each with 4 people in it. So imagine that you had lines that were drawn sort of like perfect squares, and within this population, there are 4 people of MENA descent. However you want to describe that, Dr. Salih, whatever the choices that you chose on your census, but let's say there's 4. And as a result, there's 1 person in each district, not enough to be able to have significant impact on the choice of candidates, assuming that the rest of the residents don't necessarily agree with you on who you want to vote for. Next. 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 So this might be another way of drawing those lines, because maybe during the testimony, lots of people of MENA descent who live in Glendale, let's say, or maybe in San Diego. I know we've got Ramla on the call. So they're coming forward and they're saying, hey, we live in this neighborhood and we live together, and we'd like to have a district that doesn't cut us into 4 different pieces, right? And so as a result of that testimony and people listening, and they've played their cards right and they've sort of made the political connections that they need to, now the entity that's drawing the lines draws the lines in a way that holds that community whole, and now they are 3/4 of that district. Now you can imagine the kind of voting power that this MENA community has in being able to choose a candidate of their choice. Next. So that really demonstrates the importance of why communities really need to get involved in redistricting, because you could be split into 4 different pieces, or you could be held whole. Next. Now, by the way, this is a picture of me 1,000,000 years ago, working with the Korean American community, which had exactly this experience, right? The Korean American community in Los Angeles was split into 4 different districts. And time again, they came to the legislature and they said, we'd like to not be split into 4 districts. And the reason why they were put into 4 districts was because it just so happened that there's a very valuable piece of real estate along Wilshire Corridor, and every politician wanted a piece of that, right? So you want the donors, you want the businesses, you want the business development that comes from that. And so Koreatown was split into 4 different pieces. And no amount of people coming to assembly hearings. Sometimes they were packed with 200 or 300 Koreatown residents, could convince the electeds to willingly put all of Koreatown into one district. Next. So this is now California's story. In 2011, the legislature had 4 months of hearings, but ultimately they drew the lines behind a cloak of secrecy. And in fact, actually, the day that they voted on the districts was September 12th, 2001. Next, which was a day after the 9/11 strikes. And while the rest of the country was in a media blackout, the legislature decided that they needed to engage in redistricting and quickly moved to vote for the lines in a way that would cut up a lot of different communities, but they did it under a cloak of secrecy. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about the direct impact. I described it theoretically, but this is a real impact. This community, for those of you who may be looking at this, you might think that I was showing you a picture of Michigan or maybe someplace in the Northeast where the snow hits hard and cars are driving through several inches and they can't move because they're buried, right? This picture is actually from Southern California. This is the community of Watts, which is heavily African-American and Latino. And there was a freak hailstorm that happened in the 2000s. And when that community was hit, they went from congressional office to congressional office to ask for a federal emergency to be declared so that they could get aid to rebuild their houses. I'm imagining that if you're in Southern California, this picture is a very foreign one to you, right? We don't oftentimes get hit with this kind of weather. Next. So this is a picture of what Watts looks like on the map in green. And you can see how they are split into 3 different districts. And so as a result, next, when they went to congressional offices and to Senate offices and to assembly offices where they were each time divided into 3 pieces, they were told by those offices, we don't really represent you. There's too small of a part of your community. Go to the next office. They were essentially ping-ponged from one office to another. And we have actually testimony from people who worked in those offices who remembered residents coming to them, asking for help, and remembered that there was a calculation about who was in their district and who needed to be served. And since Watts wasn't all in one district, they kind of sent them on their way. It took more than a week for the state to finally declare a state of emergency, which if the community had been held in one single district, they would have had enough voice. You remember, right? So 3/4 of the district, if they had been held together, they would have had enough voice to be able to demand some kind of immediate action from federal and state. Next. Next. So around the country, there's a lot of communities that are now pushing for some kind of change, because the way that redistricting has traditionally been done is that legislatures, those people who have run for office, who in any other context, we usually think of them as being exactly the right people to kind of carry our voices to the legislature, to vote on policies. When it comes to redistricting and they draw their own lines, they tend to be very self-serving. They tend to think about kind of either their own partisan interests or preserving their own ability to be able to run again and again. So there are many states around the country that have now pushed for some kind of redistricting reform. There's a picture of a woman who was gathering signatures in Michigan, I think, and thus the parka that she's wearing. There in 2018, 5 states passed redistricting reform, joining states like California to change who draws the lines, right? So in Michigan, they adopted new rules that allow for the creation of a citizens commission to draw the lines instead of the legislature. Next. What does that mean? In California, our experience in 2011 was that we picked 14 commissioners, and you can see the diversity here, right? It really was sort of the beauty of California and how many people who applied. There were 30,000 people who applied. so that we were able to really pick the best and brightest. And we're in that selection process right now with the California Redistricting Commission. They traveled around the country next, and they held over 100 meetings to take input from communities around the state. This is just one of those examples of a meeting that happened in Culver City where people lined up as if they were going to a rock concert, only they were going to a redistricting hearing to talk about their communities, right? And you can imagine that states that have newly adopted these types of redistricting reforms, like Michigan, where there is a huge MENA population, right? That there's a new opportunity for communities to come forward and talk about where their communities are to make sure that lines are not drawn through them, and maybe they even have a chance to form a significant part of a district where their voting power will be held whole and they'll really be able to choose candidates of their choice. Next. Next. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Hoppler story. This is an individual, Thomas Hoppler, next, who did some research. He is actually, if you haven't heard of him before, he is someone who did the redistricting for one party, the Republican Party. Let me just say that there are Thomas Hopplers for both parties, so it's not like Republicans are unique in this. But in the 2001 and 2011 process, he was the mastermind who traveled around the country and drew the lines whenever Republicans controlled the redistricting process and controlled the legislature, right? His story is interesting because he actually did research on Texas and found that if you could add a citizenship question to the census, in his words, next. Oh, I see, sorry, back up. It's in white. So unfortunately, the words cannot be seen. Those are the most important ones. But it says, a switch to the use of citizen voting age population as the redistricting population, instead of what I just said, which is the total population, right, would be, and what you can't see, the words are advantageous to whites and Republicans. He did this research on Texas. He figured out that if you could add a citizenship question, you could eliminate thousands of Latinos primarily from the population that is used for redistricting, and that would create enough of a skew that he could create a significant advantage for Republican control of those districts for the rest of the decade. When we found this information from our discovery process in a case that we brought in North Carolina, Common Cause versus Lewis, that information was immediately shared with groups that were challenging the citizenship question on the census, and it led to the Supreme Court saying that the citizenship question needed to be removed from the census, right? So there's a direct connection between the work that we're doing around redistricting and and how we need to advocate and vociferously push for the census to count every single person, because when the census counts every single person, you can make sure that the representation also includes every person. Otherwise, we fall victim to the efforts of people like Thomas Hoppler to try to skew redistricting, skew representation so that it is advantageous to one party or to one race. Next. I just want to end on a positive note, and that is that, yes, there are people who are scheming to do things to try to take away power, but there's also very positive examples of Democrats and Republicans working together to try to end gerrymandering, right? And here's a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger, our former governor from California, Republican, and Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General under President Obama, working together to push for laws that are fairer and to push for litigation to open up this whole process. And with that, I'll hand the microphone back to Sandy.